¿Qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Buenos días a todos y a todas. Mi nombre es Carla Grados y es un súper gusto estar con ustedes hoy día. Hoy día vamos a tener una sesión en inglés, por eso les voy a pedir a todos y a todas las que quieran escuchar la sesión en castellano, es decir, traducida, vayan al botón que dice sesión en español, que se encuentra justo debajo de sesión en vivo. Denle clic ahí ahora y ahí voy a pasar a hablar en inglés porque nuestro invitado nos acompaña desde la Universidad de Nueva York o New York University. Estamos, entonces, ahora sí, empezamos oficialmente. Welcome, everyone, to the last official day of CADE Jóvenes Líderes. I have the luck, and I'm really happy to be with a friend, actually, and a really important person in the world of sustainability, business, and now serendipity, that is Dr. Christian Busch. Today, I couldn't be more excited or thankful to moderate this session. First of all, because it's extremely relevant and important due to our current situation, due to COVID. And second of all, because of the amazing speaker you will actually listen to today. We're here to talk about how to turn uncertainty into opportunity, or accelerate serendipity, in other words, through the building of strong communities. You guys are an amazing community, a really strong community, actually, and have the power to do incredible things, as you will see in Christian's presentation today. Our speaker is none other than, as I said, Dr. Christian Busch. He's the director of the Global Economy Program in New York University's Center for Global Affairs. He's a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, co-founder of Leaders on Purpose and Sandbox, a really important network. He's part of the World Economic Forum's Expert Forum, and his ideas have been featured in Harvard Business Review, The Economist, in between others. And he recently published a book called The Serendipity Mindset, and today is all gonna be about serendipity. Christian will give a 25-minute presentation, and then we can move over to Q&A, to some questions. You can actually start giving your questions or writing your questions from now on up until the Q&A session. So now I'm going to move over to Christian. Christian, I'm really happy to have you with us here today. So welcome officially to CADE Jóvenes Líderes. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Carla, for the días a todos. It's wonderful to be here with you. I'm very nostalgic. I used to spend a lot of time in Mexico and Chile, and then in Peru. My brother actually studied in Peru, so my heart is there. I would have loved to be with you in person. Hopefully next time we get the opportunity. I have the pleasure to talk today with you about two topics that are very close to my heart and that hopefully will be very relevant to you, kind of embarking on really shaping the world further, which is on the one hand, communities and ecosystems. So how do we build strong groups of people? Because obviously a lot of the change in the world depends on people working together and doing that effectively. And then on the other hand, the question of how do we cultivate serendipity? How do we, in a way, learn to turn uncertainty into and the unexpected into positive outcomes? It's something that I've seen work with the most purpose-driven and the most impactful leaders around the world. And so I'm very excited to share that with you. To give you a bit of context, my journey started when I was kind of around 18 years old. I used to be this rebellious teenager. I had to repeat a year in high school. I was, I spent my energy on a lot of things, but not really on school or other things. And so on one day, though, I wasn't so lucky anymore, and I was in a car accident. I crashed into 4 parked cars, and I will never forget the policeman who came to the scene. And he was like, "Oh my God, he's still alive." And this idea of that I was supposed to be dead, that really stuck with me, and it put me on this intense search for meaning, trying to figure out what is life all about. And I started reading this wonderful book, Viktor Frankl's Search for Meaning, Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about trying to figure out how can we still find meaning in even the toughest of circumstances. And so, it put me on an intense journey. And what I realized, what I enjoy the most doing, that gives me a lot of meaning, is connecting people, connecting ideas, and see how it all fits together. And one of the first things that on that journey happened is that I met some wonderful people in Zurich, and we set up together a community called the Sandbox Network. And so the Sandbox Network identifies around the world exciting, brilliant people who have big ideas, and then brings them together in a community where they can share each other this idea, where they can support each other. And the idea was really to say, if you're an exciting person, a lot of times you're connected in your own fields, but mindset-wise, you're much closer to people in other fields who have similarly big ideas. And so the idea was, let's bring that together around the world and have people have these access points. And one thing that really kind of over the years happened, I then went on to go into entrepreneurship and later into research. And I became more and more fascinated by the question of how do we build really impactful communities? And one of my favorite quotes is of Margaret Mead. She used to say that you should never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because indeed it is the only thing that ever has. And that's why communities, so kind of bringing these groups of people, to me is so exciting and important. And also I think for leaders and future leaders, because it is all about that idea that change always seems very abstract and it seems like it's out there. But actually, once we really kind of find a small group of people who are similarly excited and passionate, then actually the real magic happens a lot of times. I want to give you an example of this. I don't know who of you came across, a couple of years ago, there was this volcano that broke out with the unpronounceable name, E and then 14 letters, if I recall. And it broke out and it grounded all the flights in London and in the UK and most of Europe. And so during that period, there was the largest forum for social entrepreneurs in the world, the Skoll World Forum. And so all these amazing people, they were all stuck in London and they were all like, okay, what do we do now? And so I got a call on a Saturday morning, from an unknown number. I had been out the whole night and I was like, oh my God, what's this number? And so I picked up, and on the phone, there was this guy who was like, hey, look, Christian, we haven't met yet, but a mutual friend gave me your number. And, I just wanted to check in. I'm stuck in London with all these other amazing people. So I was thinking, hey, might as well do something with this. Everyone has their schedules cleared. So why don't we organize a conference? Within 30 hours, Nathaniel put together TEDx Volcano, which became one of the most successful local TED conferences of all time. He did that with almost no resources and essentially knowing only 2 people in London. So how did he do that? And the key thing here is really that he didn't have to build a whole community, a whole network, a whole ecosystem from scratch. He already relied on the proxy trust, on the trust that people had because he was part of the same community, of the same group. And that is really something that a co-founder at Sandbox used to call, we have to enable weak ties to work as if they were strong ties. So we have to take all these people, that we might not know that well, but essentially by making them part of the community where they trust each other and they start building that trust with each other, they start trusting each other much more and then can make these big ideas happen. And now that is really leading us to that kind of key topic that I wanted to speak with you about, which is really about this question of how do we develop these groups of people that care about each other, that feel they belong together, and by doing this, enable each other. Now, there's 5 pillars that we've identified over the last years when we think about curated innovation communities and kind of really developing this. The first one is really about this question of an action-driven purpose. So how do we answer this why? How do we answer the question when someone comes into a room and says, why am I here? What am I doing here? And when they walk out, they need this feeling of, okay, I'm working on something bigger here, or I'm part of something where I really care about it because it is part of my life now. And this is something Holsti, which is this wonderful company, it's a social enterprise in New York. And they essentially, they do a lot of eco-fashion and other things. And one of the things that's been really good at is to say, you know what? We have these core, like they did a manifesto with their core values. And every process now, everything they do always has to stick to those kind of values. And so if you are coming into that community, if you're entering the door, they essentially try to understand, does this person really fit that culture? Does that really fit into what we're doing here? But also when we then promote people, when we try to put people into leadership positions, do they really resonate with those values? And if not, maybe that doesn't work. And so that's, of course, a lot of times also, when you think about everything from government agencies to companies to communities, that question of how do we identify those people who become role models, not only in terms of performance, but also in terms of those kind of values, and how do we celebrate them? How do we incentivize them? How do we make sure that our performance reviews are really geared towards saying those people who really practice these values in the day-to-day should be remunerated appropriately? Now, how can we create this? So one is really around these kind of questions of defining the in-group and defining who is part of the group and who isn't, and making that based on ideally as inclusive sectors as possible, but really identifying that at the core of it. But also then this kind of idea of building this kind of trusted umbrella or brand, you saw that in Chile, for example, where I think for quite some time, the government tried to figure out, how do you take things such as Startup Chile and really develop a trusted umbrella around it, where then entrepreneurs become part of a community, join that community, and go through shared experiences. And at Sandbox, one thing we realized is that it's one thing to take people into a group, but what really builds the trust is that shared experience of saying, wow, do you remember 5 days ago when we did X, Y, Z? Do you remember when we went through that journey together? And so really building journeys, building joint mutual journeys, really being at the core of these kind of frameworks of trust. But then, of course, one of the things that, I know that a lot of you are really excited about and passionate about is trying to figure out how do we really create innovation and impact in a way that is up to the challenge, right? Societal problems, environmental problems are so intricate and that they are so complex that no single person can solve them alone, no single government, no single organization. So we need to find a way to bring people together from different fields, but at the same time make sure that they have something in common. Because what you will see a lot is, people always talk about diversity, and then they put diverse people into a room, and then they're surprised that there's no outcome. Why? Because the people, they all speak their own quote unquote language. But if we then find that common denominator, away from saying, we all have to be from X, Y, Z background, to the question of, okay, what is the core value we all have in common? Or what is the core thing that defines who we are? And by doing this acts as a filter for us to identify who should be here and who shouldn't be here. And that really allows people to build that kind of in-group feeling. Now, I know that quite a few of you also think about how do you essentially scale these kind of things? So let's say you're working on a project somewhere in Lima or somewhere in Mexico City, and you say, hey, I would love to take that into different contexts, and I would really love to work with others on it. And one of the things that I've been very excited about, a lot of my work has been in very low income contexts, and it's really this idea of trying to figure out how do we work with local organizations in ways that really accepts and takes into account that everyone has their local traditions, everyone has their local ways. And so we need to figure out what can we quote unquote standardize. So what are the things such as our core values that are non-negotiable, such as maybe a low income education methodology in this case? What are the things that should be there? But also then what are the things that should be locally adapted? So what are the things that if I'm a local person, that is what I'm bringing to the table so that I feel ownership of it. And so there's this wonderful organization called Reconstructed Living Labs in the Cape Flats in Cape Town. They now reach over 200,000 people with a very low income or low cost education methodology with essentially almost no resources. And the way they did that was to say, you know what, when we go into a new community, instead of saying, here is XYZ money or budget to fund a couple of teachers who come in, we do the opposite. We go into this context and our first question is, what is already here? Is there a former drug dealer who could become a teacher? Fantastic. That person will be really, really good at really kind of understanding how to, leverage local connections. They will be really good at kind of creating local legitimacy and becoming a role model if they become a teacher. It's also really about them thinking about how do we essentially think differently about the resources we have locally. So for example, they have a budget methodology where if you would organize an event, let's say you organize an event for 50 people and you want 50 chairs, right? Usually what we do is we create a budget item and then we say, this is what we need. They say, you know what? It's great that you need these 50 chairs, but we first need you to answer, do you really need the chairs? Or can people sit on the floor? Can they sit like somewhere on benches, whatever is around? If you really need the chairs, does someone around them have them here? Is there a restaurant that is closed at the time you need them and you could borrow them? Or is there any other ways where you can make the best out of what is already here rather than trying to get those resources in? And the interesting thing here is that it's not only about being cost effective and being resourceful, but it's also about giving people locally the feeling, actually, here's a lot here already. We don't have to ask the government. We don't have to ask all these outside organizations for help, which a lot of times creates a more passive mentality versus really this kind of active mentality of, thank you, you gave us a sense of direction, but now we can create our own luck here locally. And that is really kind of coming to this question of how we can create those local multipliers, those local people. And I think some of our conversations earlier on have been around this as well.
Sorry to interrupt. We're actually seeing your presentation really small. I don't know if there's a way to put a presentation view, like a full screen view.
Yeah. That's a great point. And that's actually something where I think, I think when I do it full screen, then probably I can't see you. So I was always trying to figure out to do both, but I think that works pretty well as well. I trust that you let me know whenever the presentation is gone.
Don't worry.
Thank you so much, Carla. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. This is actually the visual of it. And that's a great point that so here you can see the big nodes, right? So these are the kind of local people who could represent a local company or be representative of the government or others. And then the question being, how do we link them? And a lot of the times we link them via the kind of different aspects that I mentioned, but the important thing being the local buy-in and the local idea of how can I shape this into something that I have some kind of impact in. And so obviously one key way we can do that is via technology. And what I found fascinating is that, I always came in with this idea, we need high tech, we need everything that is so up to date. And then I realized, you know what? Actually, once we understand tech as a platform and not as a solution, we see that actually a lot of times low tech might be much more effective, because essentially when people anyways have a simple phone that they use to, communicate with each other, then we need to somehow learn how to put our stuff on their phones rather than, developing an app that nobody uses and then essentially kind of forcing people into something that they will anyways not use. And so one of the big themes I think we can also talk about later is how do we essentially leverage technology smarter, in the sense that it's not about big technology, high technology, and all these kind of superior things we think technology can do, but it's about trying to understand how do people live their day-to-day life and how do we become part of this, and technology just being a way of making that simpler, but not as a new way to kind of interrupt how people live locally. And I think that will be something that will dive deeper. But so the second part now, I'd love to dive deeper into something that I know a lot of us have been very excited about, and that really kind of came out of the last 15 years of my work as community builder, entrepreneur, and researcher, is that the most purpose-driven, successful, inspirational people, they have something in common. They intuitively cultivate serendipity. Essentially, they see something in the unexpected and turn that into positive outcomes. And that's really something, if you think about in your own life, I mentioned the example of Terrace Volcano, which was this kind of serendipitous happening. But also, think about the simple situation in the coffee shop, right? You're sitting in a coffee shop, you're drinking your coffee, and if you have slightly erratic hand movements as I do, you spill coffee all the time, right? And so imagine the situation, you spill the coffee over someone next to you, and now you have two options. Either you say, oh my God, I'm so sorry, here's a napkin, and then you walk outside and you're like, what could have happened had I started a conversation with this person, because you might have sensed this connection, but you didn't really do anything with it. And then option two is, of course, you spill the coffee. You're like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I was reading this book and, I got so excited and that you start a conversation, and maybe that's how you find your co-founder. That's how you find the love of your life or other things. It's these kind of unexpected moments where we have choices, where we can, based on our decisions, form and shape how life plays out for us. And if you think about the biggest kind of incidences in your life, how, everything from maybe how you kind of met the person you love, to how you created the big government policy, how you created a company, like everything that somehow shaped our lives. We always have this assumption that we can plan it all out and that we map it all out, but then we have this unexpected encounter or this unexpected reading that we have, and then life turns out completely different. Here's a couple of examples also, just for you to see how broad the application is. Everything from, for example, here breweries turning into hand sanitizer companies because they unexpectedly realized we can't use our alcohol anymore for restaurants because they don't buy from us at the moment. So we have to rethink our capabilities and now essentially sell them or produce hand sanitizer, because that's the big problem at the moment. Here's one of my favorites, actually. Can anyone guess what that on the bottom right is? Any? I don't know if we have the comment function, but if not, so this is a potato washing machine. And so the idea with this potato washing machine was, it's a company I've been working a lot with in China called Haier. And so essentially they had, this problem that farmers were calling them up and they were saying, you know what, we're trying to wash our potatoes in your washing machine and it always breaks down. And, why do you produce such a crappy washing machine? What would we usually do? We would probably say, well, don't wash your potatoes in the washing machine, right? It's just not made for that. What did they do? They did the opposite. They said, you know what? It's unexpected that you're washing your potatoes in there, but there's a lot of farmers in China. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how serendipitously one of their kind of most interesting products emerged. The same is with you know, products like Viagra. The same is with communities like Sandbox. The same is with the biggest policies. You know, Henry Kissinger famously was constantly kind of creating serendipity at every conference he went to. And so the point is that at the end of the day, if we look at how we make decisions and how we really kind of shape our lives, we always assume that we can plan everything out. But instead, this happens what you can see here, that we can create this kind of smart luck, and that smart luck usually comes out of the unexpected. And so this is really the opposite of the blind luck. You know, blind luck being born into a good family, having loving parents, like all the things that are passive, right? We can't influence them that much. But then there's this kind of active smart luck that's all about seeing something in the moment and connecting the dots. And so here you see all these examples I mentioned earlier. They have these things in common where you have some kind of trigger. So, you know, COVID happening and the brewery has to readjust its capabilities towards producing hand sanitizer, or the financial crisis happening. And so we didn't find sponsors for Sandbox and had to get away from the idea of a conference to creating a hub model, which was locally embedded communities, which in the long run actually turned out to be the most fortunate thing because it forced us to build local communities. The same with Viagra, the same with the coffee shop example. There's this kind of trigger, but then we have to do something with it. We have to connect the dots and relate it to a bigger problem. And that then enables us to create that unexpected good luck. Now, the problem, of course, is that we miss serendipity most of the time. We might not see the trigger, right? So if COVID happens and we are a brewery, we might just say, oh my God, how do we still sell to restaurants? And so we might not see, hey, this might be a great opportunity to use the same thing we have, the capability of producing alcohol and doing something with it to turn that into hand sanitizers and actually become a much bigger company, and so on. So we might not see those kind of connecting the dots opportunities, but also we might not have the tenacity to actually do something with it. And so for the sake of time, I want to just kind of give you a couple of thoughts on how important the question of framing is, because at the end of the day, so there's an experiment that a colleague of mine in the UK did, where he took people who self-identify as very lucky, so people who say, good things always happen to me, and I'm always kind of, you know, living a good life, and people who say, bad things always happen to me, accidents always happen to me, and he says, okay, you know what? Walk down the street, go into the coffee shop, order a coffee, sit down, and then we'll have an interview, nothing else. Now, what he doesn't tell them is that there's hidden cameras across the street. There's a £5 note in front of the door. And then inside the shop, there's only one chair next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big ideas happen. Now, they take one lucky person, and the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, has a nice conversation, they exchange business cards, potential opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's that. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I made new friends. I found money in the street and, you know, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. Now, the unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And that's really something we've seen in a lot of our work as well, but the idea of how we frame the world, and that's why we talked about earlier when we talked about communities, the importance of how we look at also the people we work with and how we frame the world around them, predefines so much of how much people can create their own luck or see something in the moment. One of the things, of course, that we're all really interested in is the question of how do we, at the end of the day, you know, in a world that is so socially unequal and where we have a lot of kind of big problems out there, how do we, in almost any situation, develop that kind of mindset that allows us to cultivate that kind of mindset or those kind of qualities that allow us to have more smart luck? And so I wanted to finish that presentation with just a couple of thoughts of or pointers of how we can create that in our own lives, but also then in the communities we work with and in the, you know, government agencies, in the companies. One is really on a very individual level, something that I'm a huge fan of, this idea that you can use every conversation to set hooks or to cast hooks. So in every conversation, take this dreaded "what do you do" question. Imagine you meet another person who's working in government or another person who's working in a company, nowadays fully via Zoom, and you just ask, so what do you do? And that puts people into a box, right? Because now essentially you place them in a certain environment. Now, if you would be Ollie Barrett, who's a wonderful entrepreneur in London, when he gets the dreaded question of what do you do, what he says is, well, I'm a technology entrepreneur, but recently started reading into the philosophy of science. But what I'm really excited about is developing XYZ technology. Now, what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence. My colleague just started the philosophy of science seminar, you should come in. Or, oh my God, such a coincidence. We just started looking into XYZ technology, we should talk. The point is that in every conversation, we can think about how do we seed a little bit of kind of interesting information that allows other people to connect the dots for us and to create that serendipity for both of us. Now, another one is really about looking at mistakes and crisis differently. I mentioned the example of for example, TEDx Volcano, but we can also create rituals within our organizations that allow us to constantly cultivate serendipity, especially in those moments where something didn't work out. So one example is the project funeral or the post-mortem, where essentially, in most companies or in most organizations, people have an incentive to hide things if they don't work out, right? So imagine you work on a project, that project doesn't work out, and now the instinct is, oh my God, hopefully nobody sees this because it seems like I'm a failure. But actually, when you now say, you know what, usually we only mostly learn from each other if something doesn't work, because that's the moment of real learning, right? That's the moment of real kind of experimentation. So what those organizations do is they say, whenever a project doesn't work out, the project manager who's responsible for it presents it in front of other people from other divisions and lays it to rest. And they say, you know what, this is what we learned from what didn't work out. So it's not about celebrating failure, but it's about celebrating the learning from what didn't work, the learning from the experimentation. And so now what happens is, like in this one company, they had this window frame. And the idea was that the light wouldn't reflect them. It's an amazing technology. But they didn't realize, a lot of people wouldn't pay a lot of money for just having a fancy glass. So they laid it to rest and they said, you know what, next time we'll think differently about the market, and we'll think differently about how we will price this. Now, someone in the audience goes, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered if you would put that into a solar device, how much energy that could absorb? And that's how actually part of their solar division emerged. Now, when they talk about it, they would say, oh, it was just lucky that this person was in the audience. It was just lucky that on this day, the timing was right. But you know what? They created a ritual that made it much more likely that the timing would be right and that the right person would be there at the right time. And that's really about how in our organizations and the way we design policies, the way we design rituals within companies, we can really think about creating these kind of opportunity spaces where that becomes much more likely that people have these kind of moments happen. And that's really kind of closing on a couple of other thoughts here, where we talked about the reframing in the example of Arlet, but also really kind of the question of how do we leverage technology in space design. That's a lot about, I'm a big fan at the moment, COVID, of course, keeps you away from having those water cooler moments with your colleagues, right? Where you were just running into someone. But one of the things that I've found very useful is what Google and others are doing is random coffee trials. So essentially they're saying, okay, employees within the company pick a particular time in the week and then say when you're free, and then they will randomly connect you with someone else in the company, ideally it's someone they don't know yet, with an inspiring question, inspiring prompts, and then they just have lunch together or, virtual coffee together. And the idea here is that kind of both creates serendipity because people kind of unexpectedly meet and then a lot of times talk about something inspiring with that kind of prompt, but also it makes people feel a stronger belonging to a company or an agency because they feel, hey, I'm actually still able to run into people here rather than being completely disconnected with my small team virtually at home. And now, last but not least, and this is obviously a lot of kind of just a lot of points at once here, just to kind of also trigger a little bit of the conversation that we can have. But I wanted to bring in the last point, which I think is especially important for policymakers and governments, but also then for leaders of companies, which is really this question that a lot of times we belief that in order to portray strength as a leader, we have to pretend that we have it all figured out, right? So we have to say, oh my God, this is exactly my plan. This is exactly what I want to do. And then the unexpected happens and we almost have to hide it, right? We have to figure out a way to not show that we didn't plan everything. Otherwise, it seems like a weakness. And so the point, though, is that, of course, in a fast-changing world, we can't know everything and we can't plan everything out. So building a muscle for the unexpected that allows us to constantly cultivate that serendipity while having a sense of direction actually can be much more effective. What do I mean with it? So give you an example with, the governors here in the US. Like some of the governors, when COVID happened, they went out and they said, you know what, we will open up our state at exactly this time. This is my exact timeline. This is the exact steps that we will take. Now, the problem with this approach is that there will always be unexpected information, right? There will be another outbreak somewhere. There will be this and this. And so you will have to revise your timeline or you will have to hide the data. And so that brought a lot of people into kind of very tough spots because now they seemed like, oh, they didn't really know what they were talking about. Now, what Governor Cuomo did in New York, I mean, he missed a little bit of the initial one. But what he did at some point was, you know what? I have two principles here. I want public health and, economic health for everyone. But, these principles are here. I will give you a timeline. This timeline is an approximate timeline, but I will tell you based on these two principles, I will revise that timeline when and whenever new information will come in. So what he did here is he set a North Star. He set a sense of direction. So everyone could say, great, he knows what he's doing. But at the same time, he said, you know what? I know that there will be information I can't know about yet, and I have to price this into this model. And that's what we've seen. So we recently finished a study with 45 of the top CEOs in the world. We sat down with them for 1.5 hours and really tried to understand what is it that really makes them successful. And one of the key patterns that came out of it was that they're extremely good at developing a North Star, a sense of purpose, a sense of direction, but also this idea that people within the company need to be empowered to come up with unexpected ideas and related to this. And rather than seeing that as a problem, as something that they didn't plan for, they see that as a strength, because it's a strength of a strong corporate culture to essentially be able to bring those ideas in and to have, quote unquote, an emergent strategy that relates to those kind of bigger North Star ideas. And so long story short, this is really about saying at the end of the day, a lot of times serendipity really emerges when we have a sense of direction because we know what we connect something to, but at the same time, we also need to give people the agency to actually see something in the unexpected. So wrapping this up, we talked obviously about two bigger themes now. So the one theme was really about communities and ecosystems. How do we develop them? How do we strengthen them? And then on the other hand, what communities accelerate a lot is kind of the serendipity base level. So this idea of how much serendipity we can have in our lives, how often we can have that, and what the quality of that can be. And that really comes back to, I grew up in Heidelberg, where Goethe and Schiller wrote their poems, and there's this philosopher's way. And in this philosopher's way, Goethe was writing a lot of his work, and he had this beautiful saying that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as what they could be, you make them capable of becoming what they can be. And everything we just talked about is really about that idea that serendipity is about potentiality. It's about the idea of what could be. It's about the idea that we as leaders have to develop platforms that enable people to become who they're capable of becoming, rather than just taking them as who they are and then essentially putting them into a box. And that's really about, we talked during the last days. I mean, I've been very fortunate here to be surrounded by wonderful people who are very much into the question of how are you good parents? How do you bring up kids in a way that really empowers them? And it's a very similar story, right? In the sense that how do you essentially enable them to become who they can be without kind of like putting them into boxes early on? And that's really about kind of letting them discover a certain way, but also giving them some kind of sense of what could be. Now, with this, I thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for joining the session. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much, Carla, again, for having me here.
No, don't worry. Thank you once again, Christian. It has been an amazing conversation, an amazing presentation, actually. We don't have much time. We have a lot of questions coming, actually, but I'm going to start with one that I think is really, really good and really into the context of the Peruvian, mainly like rural areas. So say, if you're part of a community where there's trust, then you can start building this kind of serendipity mindset within the community and catalyze it. But if you get into a new community, and maybe a rural community with different cultures, traditions, background, and a community that doesn't actually know you. And you want to go and support this community and help this community, but there's no trust between you because you're so different. And actually, you are the outsider. How can you start building trust with such a different community? And the question specifically asks if you have an example, like a personal example of connecting with this type of communities.
Mm-hmm. That's a fantastic question. And it reminds me a little bit of, so a lot of my work has been in Kenya, where you have a lot of tribes, right? You have over 40 tribes, which are extremely segregated, a lot of them. And so essentially what's happening is that if you're an entrepreneur who wants to build a business in the States or in an area that is not your own tribe, if you want to cope with government, for example, it becomes a bit tougher because, there might be a preference for other tribes. And so what I found fascinating there is in terms of how some of those entrepreneurs have built trust that we've been worked with is really to say, what is the common denominator here that I can build trust with a key multiplier here who then gives me that proxy trust? So essentially, how can I establish a relationship with someone as a co-founder, as a kind of local ambassador, as someone who has that local buy-in, that local legitimacy, and then essentially can help convey those ideas. And so this one entrepreneur, he was very smart. So he identified the governor as being the key person who has this kind of like legitimacy in one of those areas. And so the governor was from another tribe. And so what he did was he figured out where the governor went to church. And then he literally kind of sat in the church next to him. And after the church was over, he, in a way, I mean, I'm just kind of paraphrasing and making that much more simple. He was much more subtle about it. But he would essentially say, hey, look, governor, it's wonderful that we have the same belief, isn't it? It's so wonderful that we all believe that X, Y, Z, and that we should all be of the same community and X, Y, Z. And so he really won the governor over. Of course, the governor also saw that, yeah, this person is trying something here. But I think that kind of like chuspa also really helped him because he was like, look, if this guy is able to do this, he will be able to do a lot of other things. And so I think the key point here is really being resourceful about if there is a certain barrier or a certain kind of boundary that sets us apart, being that because we're from different tribes, different local communities, what is a way to kind of find local trusted multipliers, people who locally have a lot of like reputation, and really kind of form a relationship with them so that by affiliation, we develop that trust. And that's what I mentioned earlier, to develop ties that allow us to build trust and strong ties immediately with others because we already have the trust with a particular person. And so I think that's really one of the most powerful things I've seen to really kind of try to figure out, almost to map an informal network, because I think people are extremely good at mapping formal networks. They can tell you exactly who's the minister, who's the governor, and X, Y, Z, but mapping the informal network. Who's the local priest who's very influential? Who's the local postman who could, who's talking with a lot of people? Really thinking about these things can be extremely effective, I think, in winning local communities over.
And maybe going out of your comfort zone, because that common ground is not your common ground, but you need to find that because, well, you want to connect with this community.
Yeah,
so I have
exactly.
A second question. So you were talking about serendipity and how we can actually create a serendipity mindset. We cannot control the unknown, we cannot control uncertainty, but we can control our reactions. But what happens when you are actually afraid of the unknown? So you are already identified that something unexpected happened, but you are afraid to take action because society tells us that when the unexpected comes, we should hide, or we should think, or we should plan. So how can we start having these first reactions, like positive reactions and not negative reactions to this uncertainty?
It's such a fantastic question, especially, I grew up in Germany where the idea is, you have to plan everything, and everything that is not plannable is uncertainty, it's ambiguity, it's anxiety, right? It's like, it's something that's bad. And I think that's the same, in a lot of cultures where essentially we see the unexpected as a threat. And I think the beautiful thing that the serendipity mindset does is it turns like uncertainty from a threat into an ally, because you say, you know what, in every moment, I can see that there's some kind of meaning there. And one of the kind of pragmatic things that I found very useful to do is to do a serendipity journal, where you really kind of put down like the incidences, for example, what was unexpected over the last weeks, or what was something that was uncertain, and what is the ambiguity, and what could I see in this? Like if I would like run into this person again virtually, which kind of like where I felt, oh, I didn't really act on something, but I felt I should have. What was it about this? And can I see a pattern? Can I see something that always holds me back? Is it my inner imposter syndrome that holds me back? Is it a limiting belief because I grew up in a working class family and like my parents always told me I shouldn't be XYZ because we're supposed to be XYZ, or, you know, things. So, and I think when we then look at these patterns, we can for ourselves identify, oh, like maybe there's something where I can myself work on my own kind of overcoming my imposter syndrome or overcoming this kind of limiting belief. And I think to me, this is one of the biggest kind of barriers, you know, when you think about the biases that we all have and what holds us back from serendipity, a lot of that is really about these kind of self-limiting beliefs that there is always an objective reality, right? And there will always be structural constraints. And I think we always have to work on this, right? And that goes hand in hand to really work on policy that allows for more social equality and so on. And then at the same time, I think there's always like these kind of limiting beliefs that all of us have that we have to overcome. And I think pragmatically speaking, I think doing a serendipity journal where we understand it's so individual for everyone, right? It's very idiosyncratic what holds us back. But I think in general, a lot of times it is kind of the sense for, oh, I might not be worthy or I might not be XYZ. And so I think training this early on, and also for those of you who are parents, right? I feel that is something that's really, I've over the last days, you know, now that I'm thinking more and more about those kind of areas, I've realized, right, how early on in childhood it starts to really frame the world for a kid also, and to say, look, like you are worthy and you can do everything in every moment. And I think that kind of is really something that does a lot. And I hope also a lot of parents take on in their own journey.
And one thing that would be amazing is if you actually have a community that has built trust between them, then you can all create serendipity journals and just, you know, have the openness to share and start building like with each other and starting having this like serendipity mindset, considering your previous, you know, interactions with the unknown. And I have another question, and I really like this question because, well, in social entrepreneurship, in sustainability is a really important thing when we speak about measurements. So knowing when something is actually going on, you know, that there's a real impact. And the question is, how can we actually measure that a community is developing? Like there's trust being developed between a community, that the community is moving towards serendipity and it's a more enhanced, a positive community. How can we actually measure that? Because it sounds kind of, you know, ambiguous and hard to actually pin down. So I don't know if there's any measurement for community building and serendipity mindset within communities.
Yeah, that's such a beautiful, wonderful question. And maybe to preface this with an example, why I feel this is so important to not only look at the individual level in terms of individual outcomes, but also especially on the community level. I will never forget. So one of the first times I started working in sub-Saharan Africa, I came into Kenya, and there was this education NGO, and they were educating kids, you know, and high school age. And I will not forget, you know, this boy, he had a scratch in his face, and I asked him, why do you have this scratch in your face? And he was like, well, my father is beating me. And, you know, he didn't want to tell me why, but so we built trust. And over time, he opened up and he said, well, he's beating me because now that I'm in school, and my father, like, he has kind of issues with his eyes. My mother is pregnant, and I only have a sister that's even younger than me. So you know, I was the one bringing in the money for the family. And now, because I'm in school, my sister has to bring in the money. And there's, of course, not a lot of options for a young girl in such a poverty construct in that this organization was working to bring in money. And so the point here is now the father has a lot of resentment against the boy and beats him because they feel that, yes, they have the privilege now to go to school, but the whole family suffers in some sense. And he also uses big words that the rest of the family doesn't understand and so on. And so the point here is that the output, when you would ask the education organization, did you have some kind of impact? They would say, yes, of course, we educated a boy. Like, how great is that for an impact? But then actually, when you look at the community level, they destroyed the community trust. They destroyed the kind of community glue between those different generations, because essentially they didn't think about things such as, how do we build in a revenue model for the family so that the family has that income still? How do we think about how to educate the whole family rather than just individual and so on? And I think that's the same for serendipity, that if we only think about the kind of well-being of one person, right? It's easy to observe this, right? It's easy to observe. So for example, a lot of our work is qualitative. So we look at like over time, we essentially try to understand how does a person face this situation, how do they react, and how does this then turn into like positive outcomes in the end or not. And so you can beautifully see serendipity evolving and emerging. And I'll give you an example there in a second. But then also the real importance, and I think that's for especially those of you who are creating policies and creating opportunity spaces for people, and especially also in local communities, like really this question, how do we essentially develop a kind of social opportunity frame for people so that they have more serendipity happen in their own lives as well. And so one example here is really when you think about education policy, it's not only about thinking about giving XYZ scholarships to people, but it's about saying, if I give a scholarship to them, how do I make sure they also get a related network, access to that related network that gives them access to that kind of, you know, people who can help them connect the dots and everything else? Because if they still go back to the family, which can't necessarily help them connect the dots, it doesn't really help them a lot. And so I think that's less about measurement and more about really conceptualizing also what is the kind of impact we want to have. Is it just about the individual level, someone having more serendipity, which is in a way almost easier to create because you can train yourself, you can train how you connect dots and everything else and how you look at the world. But then on the societal level, this question of how do we develop these kind of networks, which is why I was pushing so much on the community side, because it was really about saying, how do we create communities that are diverse enough, but still have a common denominator so that serendipity can happen more often. And so the way we looked at it then at Sandbox was, Sandbox in the end was a serendipity accelerator, because it was essentially saying every dinner you would always hear, oh my God, such a coincidence, such a coincidence, such a coincidence. And so it was really about an acceleration of this. And so I think, again, it's very hard to measure this in itself. We can easier measure this on the individual level because we can look at counterfactual. So what could have happened, right? The coffee shop example, you can think about what could have happened had I not spoken with this person. Or, you know, we see that a lot in research where people who do the same experiment at the same time and unexpectedly something happens. So for example, they injected rabbits with papain, the enzyme, two researchers at approximately the same time. Rabbits' ears flopped, and one of them kind of reacted on it, right? The other one saw it as well, but they didn't do something with it. The other one kind of saw, oh my God, it seems to accelerate the blood, so maybe there is something, came up with a medication for arthritis, the disease, and that led later to a Nobel Prize and so on. But that's how you can measure it in the sense of seeing the counterfactual, and you can say, this could have happened had they acted on this, and this couldn't have. And then again, you can do the same on the societal level. But I think what's more important really is that kind of bringing that mindset into it and then seeing it evolve over time. But thank you so much for this wonderful question, because I completely agree. I think the measurement of actual outcomes rather than just kind of a couple of outputs is so important.
But I also think that it's really crucial to think that right now, even though we're speaking always about measurements and KPIs and so on, and they are necessary, just knowing that at a conceptual level, we need to think about communities and not only like individual impact, because at the end, that impact will be based on a community and that community needs to work. It's important to always have that in mind, no? As you said, in a conceptual level. I have like many more questions and they keep coming, but the people are in the background are saying like, Carla, you need to cut, and I will cut, but I just want for you to leave us, or more than leave me, like leave all the young people that are listening to you right now with a message focused on how can they actually accelerate their own serendipity through the community they are already part from. That's the CADE community. What's your message to them? Like, what would you say to them after they like end this session? Just like go outside, and what should they do? What should they start thinking about?
Yeah, I think a core message really is, you know, that even the toughest of situations, there's always something we can find in there. I mean, I had COVID in March, you know, and it seemed like one of the toughest periods I've had for a very long time. And, you know, it feels in the moment, oh my God, life is over, right? That's it. Like that's that. But then essentially kind of, you know, I started rereading the Viktor Frankl book. I started kind of getting back into the idea of, okay, what am I really about? And so it brought me back to that kind of core. And it really kind of brought home that point that he had about how Frankl always had this idea that at the end of the day, we can't influence all the situations we're in, but we can influence the reaction to the situation we're in. And I think when we are in the kind of communities we're in, especially at the moment, right? Like a lot of people feel very anxious. A lot of people feel that it's a very rough time. And if we can be part of other people's journeys and helping them through that journey and saying, hey, look, at the end of the day, yes, this situation is not the best situation we can have, but at the end of the day, there's still something we can do. And I think that is really very idiosyncratic to the context you're in. But if there's something in the context where you can still, so Viktor Frankl, for example, when he was in the, I mean, it's the toughest example that I can give, but when he was in the concentration camp, what he did every day, he would still talk with one person, just talk with them and make them feel better. And by doing this, he created meaning for himself, because he was like, wow, like even if there's no hope at all here, I can still do something. And I think that is really my key message, that like, I think doing something, just like, even if it's not the most kind of thought out thing, at this point in time, I think a lot of people need connection. They need the feeling of belonging. Like a lot of people feel isolated, right? And like really reaching out and having those conversations. And I think in terms of serendipity, it's really then, how do we have these conversations? Do we just ask, how's the weather and how's your kids? Or do we ask like, hey, what could be your next project that you're inspired by? Or, you know, and really kind of helping people think about what could be, and then being part of the journey to this, I think can be very nice and fulfilling also to really give meaning.
Thank you so much, Christian. I'm going to send you the other questions that we received and see if you can have some time to answer them. They are really, really good questions. But in general, thank you for this space. Thank you for sharing the serendipity mindset and also how to build communities. And please, if anyone has the opportunity to check out Christian's book, it's a really good book. I already started reading it. So please go ahead. And once again, thank you very much, Christian. I'm going to give some logistical announcements now. But once again, and I'm telling you this from all of the CADE team, thanks for joining CADE Jóvenes Líderes.
Thank you so much. Great to meet you. And please do keep in touch. You know, please do connect, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you are. And let's create some serendipity together. And if you're ever in London or New York, anyways, do let me know as well. And yeah, thank you so much, Carla, again, for the wonderful moderation and for having us, and to Isabel as well for pulling the strings. So much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Bueno, ahora voy a cambiar a castellano. Les pido a todos, por favor, que vuelvan a dar clic en sesión en español para que puedan regresar al formato normal, para que no esté en formato de traducción. Y ahora sí, vamos a pasar para una encuesta. Vamos a hacer una pequeña encuesta, por favor, contéstenla. Y justo después nos acompaña, y acá nuevamente estoy muy feliz de anunciar a los grandes Álvaro Hensler y Adriana Hensler para el taller de Crea tu propósito. Muchísimas gracias por acompañarme, acompañar a Christian. Ya saben, tengan una mentalidad de serendipity, vean todo lo que no conocen con ojos de oportunidad y no con ojos de miedo, y siempre con la base de una comunidad fuerte, porque esa es la manera en la que funciona mejor. Sí, muchísimas gracias y hasta la próxima. Y bueno, bienvenido Álvaro y Adrián.